During World War II in the Pacific, the battlefield didn't always look like a battlefield. Japanese defenders turned the ground itself into a weapon, hiding in tiny camouflaged fighting positions known as spider holes. Today we will create 3 variants of these using the Japanese Army Infantry platoon sprues. Here we have a mound of soil, or you could just use it as a generic crater for your games, and the wooden lid half covered with some foliage. And for ease of painting, we will attach it to the base. However, if you wish, you could do without. Your choice. And now, if you would like to attach it to the base, you will have to trim off just a few of those stray pointy bits, so it can fit nice and snug in place. A quick hobby tip with this style of blade, you could add a bit of masking tape like I have done here to pad out the lower section and stop it from digging into your thumb, thus saving you any potential hobby injury. Once trimmed, we'll just glue that crater into place. The wooden lid has 2 little legs that are underneath it, and this is going to sit on top of the mound of soil. However, to make it sit nice and flush, we're going to have to cut one tiny little bit from the crater itself so that it can lie nice and flat at the back. A quick sprinkle of sand around the soil mound was used to break up the surface and disguise the top of the base, blending it together with this natural texture. And yes, PVA glue was used for this, alongside a slightly used and battered old brush. For the second, I used a spare rifle, part number 49 on the sprue, which doesn't have a hand attached to it. And the gun stock needed to be slightly trimmed and flattened off so that it could fit into the crater itself. And just like that, you've got yourself a lone sniper sculpt. For the third spider hole, we're going to give it a bit of character, and have someone peeking out of it. Pick a head from the sprue, any head will do, and we're going to cut his lower jaw off. So we can have the head bob down in the spider hole itself, and the top of the helmet won't disrupt the wooden lid when we glue it on. You do get some extra foliage on the sprues, and these detailed leaves would be perfect to camouflage our spider holes a bit more. These concealed positions were used extensively in the Pacific. Spider holes were used by Japanese troops for ambush and close-range defense. And very bad news for advancing American troops. Painting-wise, an oak brown coloured primer by Army Painter was used, and this was the basis for the majority of the colour that was going to be on the model. For the wood, we've gone for a slightly different brown, a brigadine brown. Slightly different from our undercoat for the ground, so it stands out, but not so much that it breaks the camouflage. And for the foliage on the top, it was base coated in a dark green to keep it nice and natural. In fact, I opted for a second type of green, which was woodland camo, just to give it a bit of variation in overall colour, and to make the leaves non-uniform. The final step on the wooden lids is the netting. Using our worst for wear glue brush again, some tundra taupe was patted on to create an uneven finish. Once the base coats are painted and dry, it's time for shading. As the military shade paint is applied, the details in the leaves really start to pop, as this darker colour starts to seep into the recesses. We'll follow this up with some highlights later on to bring out the detail even more. But before that, we're going to shade everything else in a brown, strong tone paint, just to create some shading on the rest of the sculpt. Not being too particular or careful here, just slather it on and then let it dry. Okay, so now we're going to go back to our worst for wear brush, and we're going to be using a dry brushing technique to pick out that groundwork. Using onyx skin to highlight the top layer of the sculpt by dry brushing, you can see that this brush is incredibly versatile, and it's still going strong. To follow this up, prairie ochre was used using the exact same method as before, and this gave us a brighter highlight for the groundwork. The sand texture that we PVA glued earlier was also picked out using the dry brush method at this point. And whilst the paint was still on the palette, the netting on the wooden lid was also picked out by prodding on the prairie ochre paint. Now for the wood. The wooden lid received a couple of brown highlights. Because it's one of the model's focal points, extra attention was paid to create a natural, subtle grain effect. And because they're pretty quick to finish, if I'm honest, why not indulge yourself and add a bit of extra detail here and there? And that was my exact train of thought when tackling the leaves. Guardian Green was firstly highlighted to create a mid-tone colour, and this was then followed with a much brighter leafy green for the extreme highlights. Now, you can use a dry brushing method instead if you prefer, if you're short on time or you're just bashing them out for a tournament. But because there's not that much to these models, a highlight really doesn't take that long at all. On the variant leaf colour that we've done, a single highlight of olive drab was added, giving some subtle variation and keeping the foliage from looking too uniform. I mean, because we are in a jungle after all, and there's lots of different plants out there. The rim for the base gets a careful tundra taupe layer, but trying to avoid getting any onto that painted sand. However, any mistakes you might incur, we could just cover that up with some static grass. No one needs to know. Once the base rim has completely dried, and make sure it is fully dry, otherwise this next step will get messy. We can add an extra element of detail to our model. Here we used a battlefield field grass from Army Painter, and this was glued on with some PVA glue using our good old worse for wear looking brush one more time. In real life, these hidden positions made jungle combat incredibly dangerous and unpredictable, and adding these models to your army helps bring that history to life.